Hi everyone, and welcome to Playtime Online. I'm Amna Siddiqui, the producer and moderator of this program. Today we're discussing game-like learning, what it is and how educators can put today's game-like learning tips and tricks into practice in their own classrooms. We'll also be screening a portion of Institute of Play's new video series, Quest Learning in Action, which illustrates the 7 core design principles used at the New York City game design-inspired school, Quest to Learn. I also want to mention that today's panel is very interested in hearing from our viewers today, so feel free to ask questions and share with us the kinds of support you need in order to bring game-like learning into your classroom. Now, let's meet today's participants. Could everyone briefly introduce themselves? Eliza, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, I'm Eliza Spang. I am the Learning Director at Institute of Play, and my main job focus is taking what we've learned from our school in New York City, Quest to Learn, and our school in Chicago, Chicago Quest, and creating resources and tools for other teachers to use to bring game-like learning into their classrooms.
Awesome. And Kate?
Hi everyone, my name is Kate Selkirk, and I was a 7th and 8th grade Code Worlds teacher at Quest to Learn, and Code Worlds is a blend of and math content. So I'm designing curriculum and implementing it.
Thanks. And hi, Nate.
Hey, my name is Nate Sensel. I work at the Museum of Modern Art. I'm a teaching artist there, usually working with school groups that come through the museum, and I worked with Quest to Learn on this boss level project.
Great, thanks. And Shula.
Hi everyone, I'm Shula Ponet. I'm the lead game designer at Institute of Play, and I work full-time from the school that we co-founded, Quest to Learn, where I work with teachers and curriculum designers to develop the game-like curriculum and to design games that are played in the classroom.
Thanks, Shula. Thanks, everyone. And before we get started, I'd like to remind our viewers that at any point you'd like to ask today's speakers a question, just click on the blue participate text under this video on the right-hand side. We'll be spending the last 15 minutes or so of the webinar answering questions during our Q&A portion. All right, so let's start talking about game-like learning. Eliza, could you start us off today by describing Quest to Learn, the school here in New York City, what it is, the thinking behind it, and how exactly the students there are learning?
Sure. So Quest to Learn was founded by the Institute of Play in partnership with New York City Department of Education, and Katie Salen, the executive director of Institute of Play, was approached by the New York City Department of Ed to start a school that was basically game-based, taking the idea that games are really engaging for kids, so how can we take those same principles that engage kids in playing games and apply them to learning so that they are more engaged in learning content and skills. The school was started, and currently we now have grades 6 through 9. We are adding grade 10 in this upcoming year. And so over the past years, we've started to pull out what are the key principles that make a school or a classroom a game-like learning environment. And so over the past year, we developed a set of 7 core design principles for game-like learning, and we're going to talk about one in particular today, but we have 7 total. So I'm going to touch on them right now, and then over the course of this webinar, we'll talk more in detail about all of them. So the 7 are: everyone is a participant, everything is interconnected, failure is reframed as iteration, feedback is immediate and ongoing, challenge is constant, learning by doing, and it kind of feels like play. So each of those are principles, and what we've done is created a video series to show what those actually look like in action, because a lot of times when you talk about principles and more theoretical level aspects of education, it's hard to imagine what it might look like in action. And so today what we're going to talk about is learning by doing, and Kate and Nate were both involved in the video that you're going to watch about how we basically have one example of how we help our children at Quest to Learn learn by doing.
Great. So Eliza, should we watch the video now, or do you want to quickly talk about boss level?
If Shula wants to talk about boss level just to introduce it, I think that would be great.
Yep, great.
Sure.
So just a quick recap. Boss level is another experience at Quest to Learn, and Shula's going to talk about it.
So boss level is something that happens twice a year at the end of a trimester. Basically, it's a week-long, intensive, design-based challenge that the kids engage in. And if you come to the school during boss level, everything looks totally different. So the kids are in much smaller groups with one teacher, and they're not following their normal schedule. They're spending a full week sort of exploring one specific design challenge that the teachers choose based on their own passions and interests. And it's an opportunity for kids to sort of show what they've learned throughout the whole trimester in a more performance project-based way. So the video that you're going to see is an example of one boss level that Kate led in working with Nate at the Moma. And she was working with a group of 7th graders.
Great, so I'm going to go ahead and screen that segment from the Quest Learning in Action series. And there's actually, if you're watching this webinar from the Institute of Play's website, you'll see that there's a link under this video you can click on and follow along with us. We're having some audio problems, so you'll be able to see the video we're playing but not hear it. So if at this moment you could just click on that link and watch it, that would be wonderful. We're really sorry about this. It's a little inconvenient, but it's the best we can do right now. So. Hi everyone, if you're just joining us, we are screening a segment from our video series Quest Learning in Action. There's a link under this video you can click on to follow along. Hi everyone, if you're joining us just now, we are screening a segment from our Quest Learning in Action video series. We're having some difficulty with the audio, so there's a link under this video you can click on to watch it and follow along with us. All right, so hopefully everybody's finished watching the video. I guess we can just start up the conversation again. Nate, you have to leave in 5 minutes, so let's quickly talk to you for a bit. Can you talk about what it was like working with Kate and her kids during boss level, having them create and solve problems within the walls of the museum?
Absolutely. They came in with such curiosity about what was happening at the museum. I think a lot of them had been to the museum before, so they were familiar with the space. But one of the first conversations we had that I could tell they were going to be producing their own amazing work. We talked about Marina Abramovich's performance in the museum. And they were so excited. And we spent, I don't know, 2 hours just looking at her work. And talking about how she had come into the museum and engaged the visitors in making art in real time in the museum. And that's what they ended up doing at the end of our boss level week. Our design challenge was to look at how artists were using different systems or rules, kind of like game-like rules, to make art. And they created their own little systems to have visitors come in and make art that way. But it was all about interaction at the end and sharing this experience together. So yeah, I thought it was amazing.
So really quick, this is Eliza asking a question, but Kate,
Yeah.
what were the learning goals for the boss level that you and Nate worked together with the students?
I think there were a couple learning goals that we had in mind. I think originally just the design challenge in and of itself was that we wanted the kids to create an interactive art exhibit that embodied the phrase escape, and so to have some sort of experience, sensory experience that made you have that feeling. Some of the other learning goals that we had were just to use some materials, some art materials that they never used before. We wanted them to recognize some sort of key modern art artists and have them understand why some of those things were considered art. And we had a lot of interesting discussions about if someone sitting in a chair and staring at you, is that really art? And we got to talk about how experiences can be considered artwork, and that's really the main learning goal. We also wanted them to go through the design process just like the teachers do designing curriculum, and we wanted them to have that feeling of coming up with an idea, using the idea of empathy, modifying their idea, iterating, playtesting, and then actually doing the performance and implementing their design. So the learning goal really was for them to use the design process.
So for both you and Nate, how did this experience kind of illustrate the idea of learning by doing? There are lots of ways you could have reached those learning goals other than the ways that you all chose. So what made it a learning by doing experience?
Yeah, Kate, if you don't mind, I'll jump in first just to say that in the museum we looked at the different ways that artists were making work, and a lot of it is very challenging if you're looking at especially very abstract modern paintings. a lot of the artists are still starting from a very concrete place or a concrete idea. So maybe an artist using music to create a painting, to engage with his own senses in different ways to connect visual and audio information. So we had the kids try to recreate the process. So they would listen to a song and then create an abstract work out of it. And we did that with several different artists and actually tried to recreate their systems of making art before going in and having the students work with their own ideas.
Yeah, and there was an exhibit, and I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but it had all these artists with different lines sort of connecting them through circles of influence. And I think it was really interesting to realize that students as artists don't create anything in a vacuum, and all the experiences that we sort of took them through the week influenced their final design. So just a cute example is that Nate did this one activity where he sort of turned the lights off and had a can of coffee grinds and sort of threw them at the kids and just to see if they had a reaction. And then every kid, when they wanted to do their own design, were like, okay, we need a dark room and we need people can't see anything. So just the idea that artists influence each other, and when you're in a community or a school, that none of your ideas totally come from a sort of individual place, that it's a sort of group mentality that influences your art and your ideas.
Since you were working with 7th graders, how did you guys help the students to sort of explore this idea of escape and how that might be integrated into a piece of art?
Nate, do you want to start, because I know you have to leave soon?
Yeah, I mean, in all of our teaching at Moma, it's largely thematically based. So we're always working with this kind of larger idea. So we did a lot of brainstorming with them around the idea of escape and a lot of group discussions about it. And students worked with a partner to come up with their I guess it's an art project, their system that would explore whatever their idea of escape was. So I think it was Sasha and Angelique that came up with this idea of smells and how they would have the visitor smell some real flowers and some fake flowers, and the fake flowers had this like horrendous pine sol, artificial smell to it, and would make the visitor want to like escape from that area really, really quickly. So each of the pairings of students came up with a different way to approach this idea of escape, and some of it was very physical. Some of it was playing a trivia game where the questions got harder and harder as you went along until you really wanted to get out of there. So it was a way to engage with information with your senses in different ways, and struggle with this idea of what makes you uncomfortable and how do you deal with that. Yeah, there was a lot of different projects that the students came up with.
Yeah, I just want to jump in because both times I've done this Moma boss level, when we have a theme, when we brainstorm the original idea and then sort of the opposite. So when we're talking about escape, we brainstormed ideas for escape. We also brainstormed ideas for trapped. And so there was some sort of graphic organizer. And so once you brainstormed all those things, it was like, how could you recreate this in a museum space? Or how could you recreate this feeling in a small space? So just to give an example, Marcel and now I'm forgetting names. They had a Snuggie versus Thuggie art exhibit where they had people to feel trapped, put them in a sleeping bag, and sort of put a screen up. So this was an idea that you felt like you were tucked into a bed all tight with the covers and you felt really trapped, and that was the feeling they were trying to convey, but they had to use materials that we could bring to the museum and that were easily accessible. And so that brainstorm process had a lot of levels. And one other thing that we did to have the students reflect was Francis and Jessica at Moma, some of the educators there, actually conference with the students and helps them sort of make changes to their work before they actually fully designed and implemented them. So that idea of brainstorm and iterating and changing their idea did happen before the final exhibition.
So with in the video, Kate, you talk about the students taking on roles, like the role or putting their feet in the shoes of an artist, and why is that important, do you think, in learning and experiencing new things for students?
I think that Quest to Learn is a very creative school, and that the teachers are very engaged and the game designers are very engaged in creating these new experiences. But when you step into the role of an artist and you have to be the creative one, you really have to tap into your own likes and dislikes, things that inspire you. And that's a very individual experience. And because art classes are being phased out in New York City and music classes are being phased out, this really was a special experience for the students. They had access to all these materials. Nate and I did not put a lot of limits on what they were going to be able to do, what materials they could use. And so they really had this huge space. They had whatever they needed. And to have to be accountable for what you created inspired them and made them create pretty amazing exhibits.
That's really interesting, because I guess another question that ties with the whole idea of learning by doing is sometimes in classrooms students are told what to create and given specific materials, and then in this experience they were given tons of materials, kind of a wide open space to create. And I mean, we've all probably sat in both experiences, and so what do you and Nate think, Kate, you and Nate think about how students kind of react and engage in those two types of different environments? Very structured versus yours was structured but provided a lot of space to have the students learn by doing.
I think that whenever you have, and I've said this in other projects that I've done at Quest, whenever the teacher has a prescribed endpoint in mind, you sort of set the bar for the learning and you create sort of the pinnacle of what can be achieved through experience. When the teacher doesn't have a clear expectation, I think the students can often rise to the occasion and sort of exceed what the teacher's expectations might be. And that, I think, is really special. In a different assignment, I had a very similar experience. My students created roller coasters using Minecraft, and they were investigating the idea of slope. And it was a very similar thing for me in that I felt very uncomfortable not knowing, A, how to do the final project myself, and B, what it was going to look like. And so those learning experiences, when the students really are driving the end goal, I think it's much more memorable for them. I think as an experience, it's going to stick with them till their adulthood and beyond. And I think it just makes them feel more pride in the final product.
If I could just jump into on that one really quickly, I do have to unfortunately leave the chat in about 2 minutes, but I would just say that a lot of our teaching as well is about giving the students that agency of taking control of their own learning. But if they don't have the skills to do that, then it results in a bit of chaos. So I think we spent several days making sure that the students knew, as Kate had said, what some of the expectations were, learning a lot about what it means to be an artist and kind of to fill those shoes, and to think creatively and critically before having them then create their own sort of problem to solve. And I think it's that idea of creating, we didn't give them a problem, they created their own problems and used the artwork to explore that idea in some way. So I'm going to say goodbye.
Bye, Nate.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, Nate.
All right.
Yeah, so Kate, I guess, Nate, that was a great comment in terms of, from a teacher's perspective, the whole idea of learning by doing can oftentimes be scary because you are letting go of structures. But how do you think about, because you do this not only in your boss level experiences, but as you mentioned in your in some of the projects that you did throughout the school year, what do you think about to set the stage and the foundation for your students to have the knowledge and skills to then be able to do these projects where they are in more control of what the outcome is? in their learning?
So the MoMA experience was actually very structured from a teacher's perspective. Nate and I really picked out, we walked around the museum, we sort of curated the different works that we wanted the students to see that would be accessible and that they could use as inspiration. So we almost gave them a safety net. So if they couldn't come up with some sort of groundbreaking idea, there were sort of safe ideas that we were sort of storing away for the week, like squirreling away. So if you couldn't come up with anything else, at least you could fall back on this technique, or you could come back to this. We also wanted to structure not only ways for them to come up with ideas, but ways for them to practice skills. So there was one day where they were listening to music and they were sketching with charcoal. There was one day where they were reading people's poems and painting watercolors. So we pretty much every hour was structured with some sort of activity to sort of build those skills throughout the time. I think, did you want to, can you follow up with a question if I'm missing something here?
I think that's just when I was teaching, the same kind of thinking came into play. Like, how do you want to help kids basically take control of their learning and learn by doing, but it's not that you send them off immediately to go do it, and that you do need to really think about what you need to build in terms of learning experiences to help your students get to the point where they can jump off.
Right, and there were just practical things that we had to do. So I think it was really funny when they were drawing in charcoal, they would put the paper up on the wall and then they'd sort of rub their hands on it to like put the tape on the back, and they just would destroy everything they'd done. So there were so many like tactile things that they just needed to sort of warm up with and get used to, and that was pretty cool. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Shula, do you want to talk a little bit about kind of the learning by doing experience that we incorporate with game design also at Quest to Learn? So how the students are part of that process for you all?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we design a game as a curriculum team, the first thing we do is the teacher will identify the specific learning goals that he or she wants the game to sort of address. And so the first layer of learning by doing in the actual gameplay is that as a game designer, all the game designers who work at the school, we always try to tie the sort of the mechanics of the game, so what the players are doing during gameplay, directly to the learning goals. So for instance, if the learning goal is about using a ruler in the game, the players should be using a ruler so that they're actually doing it. And the game requires that they do it in order to win, and then also, again, learning requires that they do it in order to learn it. So that's sort of one layer of the learning by doing. And then I can talk a little bit about sort of the process through which we design these games. So an idea will sort of come up in a curriculum team, which is made up of a game designer like myself, a teacher like Kate, and what we call a curriculum or learning designer. And so an area might come up that a teacher identifies that students tend to really struggle with this one sort of very specific skill or piece of content. And so that will be an area around which we'll design a game. So we'll work together as a team to initially have a brainstorm about what a game might look like that incorporates that learning goal. And then the game designer will, after that meeting, go and sort of design an initial paper prototype that's very rough but playable, and we'll play it as a curriculum team. We play test it, as we say, as a curriculum team. And from that play test, we sort of see, like, is it working? Is it fun? Is it reaching the learning goals? And any feedback that comes up in that session, the game designer will then take and incorporate into another sort of more polished prototype, but still rough. And at that point, if we as a curriculum team feel confident about the game, we'll invite 4 students from the grade level that will be playing the game to come play test the game for us. And so we'll watch them play it. We'll have them fill out a short reflection form. We have a conversation with them about what they thought about the game, and they often give just like really, really useful feedback. And then we take that feedback and incorporate that into the final game for that year, at least, that will be played in the classroom. But we always say a game is never final. Even the classroom when the full classroom plays, we just think of it as another play test because we're just constantly sort of iterating on what we're doing. So as we're going through this design process, we're constantly learning by doing as well. So I think it's really important for us at the school, for a lot of these principles, to not only have them in the classroom for students, but for us as designers, teachers, educators, to also model these principles in action as we work through what we're doing.
Great. Yeah, Kate, do you want to give an example of just how, you've learned by doing in your experience with being a teacher at Quest to Learn? Because when teachers come to Quest to Learn, it is a whole new way to approach teaching, and there's a lot of new skills and knowledge to learn. So if you want to give one example of something you can think of that you learned by doing with your experience as a teacher.
Okay, well, a lot of the technology that I've been using at Quest has been completely new. So I learned, like Keynote, for example, Liza, one of the other game designers, created a template, and we sort of created this puzzle for this Alice in Wonderland themed mission that I had, and we called it Potion Motion. And I actually had to, what we wanted the students to do was have Alice be a certain size when she entered this puzzle, and then have to be a certain size to exit. So for instance, in the movie or the book, Alice eats a mushroom and she gets bigger, or drinks a potion, she gets smaller. And so we wanted to use this idea to incorporate the skill of multiplying and dividing fractions and mixed numbers. And so we wanted her to grow and shrink and, you know, have these different potions and mushrooms that she's eating to get to these different sizes. And I actually had to design the first puzzle for myself. And so we were working in Keynote, and we were sizing the different fonts and creating signs and symbols to represent the stages, like the staircase of Alice growing or shrinking. And then the end project really was the students creating it for themselves. And so we staggered it. So the first puzzle that they do, all of the sizes, or all the sizes of Alice are there, and you fill in the operation. And then the next one they did, all of the operations are there, and you're filling in the sizes. And then the third puzzle was a mixture, and so it was getting progressively harder. And then the final version was the students solving these combined puzzles. So learning by doing, it happens all the time, so it's so hard to talk about it. But learning how to use Keynote, just the technology itself, and then learning how to create a puzzle gave me the parameters that I would then give the students, the instructions to create their own puzzle. So it's sort of, when you're practicing a new skill, it really gives you the expectations for what the students will do when they create the project. Just like any teacher would make an exemplar before they've actually done a project, that it's a very similar idea. And one thing I wanted to add to what Shula was saying, sorry, there's a car parking next to me. When Shula was talking about the game designers coming in, a lot of times teachers can take some of the games that the game designers create, and the students can modify them. So there was a game called PEMDAS, which the students played to practice order of operations, and then as a project, we gave them a blank board, and they created their own set of operations and games. So the learning by doing happens with the game designers, with the teachers, and with the students on a pretty ongoing basis.
Yeah, I think, I think just what Kate and Shula were talking about is really great. They're great illustrations of how learning by doing happens all the time, and a big component or a big area where it happens is also at the end of each trimester. The students are aiming to create some sort of project to solve a mission, and so the learning by doing is required throughout the whole course of a trimester to actually create that end product. So there are lots of experiences where the students are going through, they learn, and then they learn by doing to really dig deeper into the content and skills.
Great. So let's move on and spend some time talking about the other 6 design principles, which have actually all been broken out into individual videos, like the one we saw earlier. There's actually a link to the entire Quest Learning in Action series somewhere in that paragraph text. I can bring that up above the paragraphs after this video. So could we talk about the 6 remaining principles? So To review, everyone is a participant, everything is interconnected, failure is reframed as iteration, challenge is constant, feedback is immediate and ongoing, and it kind of feels like play. So everyone is a participant. Who wants to take that one?
I can take everyone as a participant. So a really big aspect of everyone as a participant is collaboration. So collaboration is just extremely important to us at the school, and it happens sort of on two different levels. So it happens on the curricular level in the way that we develop curriculum at the school in these teams of 3 teacher, game designer, and curriculum designer. And we really co-design the whole curriculum together as a group, and then we also co-design the games and the game-like activities happening throughout the trimester. And then collaboration also happens on many levels within the school on a student level, whether it's sort of project-based learning that they're working in groups or playing a game together in groups. And just a really huge part of this is inviting everyone to participate in experiences and providing different ways for everyone involved to really contribute and work together and provide their own individual expertise and skills. So I will actually touch on the next one too, which is it kind of feels like play. So I think obviously we've touched on the fact that games are used at the school, so that's actually play. But in addition to games, the whole curriculum at Quest to Learn is what we call game-like. So every trimester in every domain at the school, students go through a 12-week-long what we call mission, where they're placed into some sort of complex problem space where they're taking on roles and trying to solve a challenge that they, in the very beginning, couldn't possibly solve until they've gone through these series of smaller quests. So they have this sort of large goal, which is broken up into a series of small goals, and oftentimes there's some sort of narrative or context that accompanies the mission. So the whole thing feels like play in a sense. Does someone want to then talk about failure as iteration?
Sorry, I can. I got kicked off the internet for a second. So failure being reframed as iteration happens a lot of times in the projects that teachers create in their missions. So for instance, Eliza and I worked together on these Prezi mazes, and this was something that also worked into the Alice in Wonderland mission context that I use in the second trimester. And so students are learning how to solve equations and inequalities. And so the way that we structured this, it was basically an assessment, is that you would have to solve a particular problem, and then your answer would be an inequality. So if x is greater than 1, follow this arrow. If x is less than 1, follow this arrow. And so what we wanted to do was create a maze that both allows students to choose harder and harder problems if they were feeling extremely capable, or they could choose sort of middle-of-the-road problems or take the easy route. But what would happen is if a student repeatedly got a wrong answer, it would send them to the Cheshire Cat, and the Cheshire Cat would say, raise your hand. And so while the students are basically taking a quiz or a test, they're being guided towards feedback. So when a student raised their hand, I was able to sort of go help them and give them sort of, maybe there was one small thing that they were doing wrong, and if I could give them one bit of advice, they could continue on with the maze. And so I don't think that they were particularly aware that they were making a mistake. Also in the Potion Motion project that you can see up there, that was also, there were a series of checks that the students would go through to make sure that their calculations were correct. And so I think a lot of times when you're using the design process, you want the end result to work and to function. And so failure, it almost as failure is not an option. You have to just keep changing your approach until you are successful. And that's something that we use all the time. The next principle is feedback is immediate and ongoing. And so I think these overlap quite a bit. So the idea that the Prezi maze, you're getting feedback as you're going. If you're going on to the next question, you realize you're getting it right. Actually, when we made harder mazes, we had to sort of change. Like the first maze, every correct answer you had to go to the left, and then the second maze we had to mix it up because students were sort of catching on. But that was a cool way to give immediate feedback. when we use games that are from outside the school, a lot of times that can factor in as well. So with the Minecraft project that I was referencing earlier, the students were creating roller coasters with Minecraft, and they had to basically create different slopes. And so they could, whether or not their Minecraft traveled on this track was giving them immediate feedback. A lot of times students would have a very sharp curve and the minecarts would fall off, or something was happening with that. So we had to, the students, by even testing the functionality of the roller coaster, could tell if they did something right or wrong. I'm trying to think of another example. With feedback being immediate, in terms of communication at Quest, email is such a big deal, and there's so much communication amongst teachers and students that even outside of the design process, they're getting a lot of feedback on their daily assignments via email, other ways, other avenues to get feedback like that. I think those are my two.
Great. So the last two are everything is interconnected and challenge is constant. So everything is interconnected really focuses on two ideas that are foundational to the Quest schools. One is that we really work very hard to connect whatever the students are learning to real-world experiences. So really giving them the opportunity to face problems and challenges that people do in different professions, and so they feel like they're not just doing math because they have to do math, but they're actually doing math to complete a challenge of some sort, or complete a maze isn't something necessarily that a professional does, but it's a challenge that the students have to do math in order to get through the maze that Kate was talking about. The other aspect of everything is interconnected is the idea of systems thinking, which is a foundational idea at Quest. It's basically helping students develop a way of thinking by looking at the world as systems. So a system is made of multiple parts, and those parts have relationships among themselves, and so when a system isn't working well and we want to change it, we actually dive in and look at the parts and the relationships and try and identify leverage points that we could change to alter how the system is working. And so that is a thread that is throughout all of the courses at Quest, and especially highlighted during Boss Level. Some examples of everything is interconnected. One is in the video Quest Learning in Action video about everything is interconnected. The idea that some students in our wellness class created TEDx videos about nutrition and exercise. So they actually had a connection to this real-world amazing experience of creating a TEDx presentation, and they spent their entire mission, their 12 to 13 weeks, developing and practicing their presentations, and then eventually getting on the special TEDx event that happens throughout the world that engages lots of students of similar ages. So that was very interesting in many levels, from connecting students to real-world experiences, understanding that they were within the system of TEDx, and then also looking at the systems of presentation and understanding the parts of what a presentation has, and how really building up success in integrating and relating those parts of a presentation really end up making a quality presentation in the end. And they received feedback from folks from TED-Ed on their presentations, which also really connected it to real world. The last principle that we're going to talk about is challenge is constant, and it's the idea of that almost everything we do is challenge-based and problem-solving. So the students are always given challenges that match where they need to be, and so that also means that differentiation is huge in all of our thinking about what students are going to engage in. And so using Kate's example of the maze that we created in the tool of Prezi, which is a presentation tool, that students, depending on where they were in their understanding of particular math skills, they would go on different paths through the maze, and all of them would build more and more skills, but some of the students may be further along in the maze, but all of them were still learning, and they were reaching the learning goals that Kate had set out in terms of challenges constant. And the idea of modding games that Kate mentioned earlier also brings in challenges constant, because the students play a game and then they're given the challenge of changing that game to make to still meet the same learning goals, but they might change parts of the game in order to have the players do something different to reach the learning goals. So those are the 6 other principles, and something really important to know about all of these principles is that there's not one that's more important than the other. They all really have to interact together to create a game-like learning environment, and not all of them happen all at once, but throughout the course of a class or a week or several weeks of a particular class at Quest, all of these will come into play in different ways. And so overall, it gives Quest courses a game-like learning atmosphere.
Great, thanks, Eliza. So we have a bunch of questions that we need to get to, but before that, Eliza, Shula, and Kate, I'm wondering if you could give us some tips for our viewers today to help them implement game-like learning into their classrooms this fall.
I'll go first. I think that a lot of times the games, you don't necessarily need a paper and pencil. You don't necessarily need a board game that's already created for you. You can make, if you're being creative, you can make a lot of experiences game-like. For example, for my last boss level, my coworker Leah and I had the students cooking, and so there was an element of shopping that had to be done, and so we actually made it game-like by splitting up the shopping list into 3 different groups, and the students had to, it was a lot of produce involved, so a lot of weighing. So the group that came closest to the end price using tax and sort of calculating the weight of different things would actually win a prize, just to make it fun. And they had such a great time. So the idea, I think when you're saying to make things game-like, you really want the enthusiasm that comes with playing a game. And that can be generated and created in really simple, quick ways. And you don't necessarily need a game designer, although they're wonderful, to make those games for you. And so you can use some of the games that we have on our website as well to give yourself a good jumping off point.
Great. I think Kate's statement is really important, that it doesn't need to be a huge complex system that you're creating for game-like learning when you're just starting out. And it's even looking at the game-like learning principles that we're talking about today, and even picking one just to test out and kind of really try and integrate in a thoughtful way in your classroom and see how it works. They all work together, clearly, but you could really focus on everyone as a participant. How do I really integrate that into my teaching, and what could be some tools that I could do that? And so you'd want to think about differentiating and having all the students access a particular learning experience through whatever your design is of your lessons. And I do feel like, and it kind of feels like play, just keeping that in the back of your mind of what is playful, and students, they will get excited about being in an environment that's playful, and in integrating that playfulness in with learning content and skills that they may not have thought would be as fun to learn.
One last thing that I'll add to that is just the power of simplicity. So in all of these games and game-like learning principles that we've been talking about, just like implementing in the classroom, it doesn't need to be like this huge thing, but actually staying very, very simple can be actually super, super powerful for a student. So that's the last thing I wanted to add.
Yeah, and one other last point. I think the fact that Shula talked earlier about the level of collaboration at the school, if you can find one other colleague at your school who's interested in integrating game-like learning into his or her classroom, or wants to try and design one game or change a game that you already know, like Clue, the board game, to teach science or teach math or something, to really work together. That 2 minds are always better than one, and it really is helpful to have a sounding board. So that would be a really big tip, is to find someone else at your school who is interested in doing this, and you all could work together and really think of ways to start to just slowly and simply integrate game-like learning into your classroom and test it out.
Great, thanks guys. So let's move on to the Q&A portion. The first question comes from Tamara, and she asks, how can educators get buy-in from stakeholders?
So are the stakeholders, I'm assuming those are students and teachers, probably?
Let's assume.
Yeah, okay. So that might be Kate. How, in your experience in working with, I think at Quest to Learn we have the student buy-in most of the time, but you could talk if you can talk a little bit about how you work to get your students excited about learning in the game-like learning atmosphere, and then our environment, and then also talking to parents about it, because it is something different than a traditional school.
I think a lot of the buy-in at Quest comes from our willingness to implement new technology. So for instance, this year we used the iPads to play a game called Dragon Box, and this was a game that's an app available on the iPad. And so just the idea that it was innovative and new and it was exciting was instant buy-in from the students. So whenever you can access a bit of technology that's popular at the current moment, that's one way to get that buy-in, and it's actually kind of an easy way of cheating. But if you can make the mission or the context really compelling, that can work as well. So my final mission was sort of this theme park design mission, and the end project was going to a theme park and looking at the various games and analyzing their probability. So in terms of student buy-in, it was really clear. I think for parents, communication is key. And if you're doing a project that's slightly unusual, that involves a lot of steps, really, like we send a lot of emails as teachers to the parents on a regular basis, giving them information. I think the more clear your expectations with the assignment, the more readily available the sort of documents are that will give instructions, can help the parents realize what's happening. At Quest, we use an online grading system called Canvas, and so that's a way to give feedback to the parents. I think parents, when they meet us at the open house and they've met our co-directors, they really they're excited to have their students go through the experience at Quest, and they just need a little bit more reassurance and communication with grades and things to know that things are actually happening in the classroom. I think that covers the buy-in, unless we're talking about other individuals. But the students and the parents need more communication, and students just want to have a good time and enjoy themselves when they're in the classroom.
Thanks, Kate. So the next question comes from Sergey, and he asks, how high does this ladder go? How far will gamification in education go in the upcoming years?
Shula, do you want to talk a little bit about gamification and how we're not quite a gamification school, just to clarify that language a little bit?
Yeah. So yeah, we are not, as Eliza said, we're not really, we wouldn't use the word gamification for what we're doing. I think gamification often implies just like throwing badges on things and accumulating points, and that's really, we're trying to do actually a lot more than that and make the game-based learning, game-like learning that's happening at the school feel more authentic and meaningful for students. And I think one thing I can say, as we are building up the school, and eventually will be 6th grade through 12th grade, as the games get developed for the higher grades, we definitely have to keep in mind sort of like what appeals to an older audience, and we try to make things more sort of real world and less can be sometimes in the lower grades in 6th and 7th grade. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yep. Okay, so the next question is from Andy, and he asks, what's the difference between game-like learning and game-based learning?
That's a great question. I can take a stab at it in terms of how I think about it. So I think about the idea of game-like learning really focused on the principles that we were talking about. So taking attributes of games and integrating it into how we design curriculum and learning experiences in the classroom or in other environments where you're learning. Game-based learning is how I think about it, is actually using games, board games, video games, as the learning experiences themselves to reach learning goals. So we do both at Quest to Learn. More of the bigger picture game-like learning where we make the curriculum more of a narrative with an end challenge, a huge challenge at the end that the students cannot reach until they've accomplished a lot of quests to learn more knowledge and skills, and then we actually use the board games and video games to help reach learning goals.
Thanks, Eliza. So our last question comes from Matt, who asks, obviously in a school based on game learning, the academic curriculum has been totally re-envisioned. What about the social curriculum? Is there a difference or unique way that you talk about or teach character, friendship, empathy, anti-bullying, etc.? What might a game on that side of the curriculum look like?
I can talk to that point. We do have core values that we want our students to embody. For example, be tenacious is one of them, get in the game, play fair, play fully. We have these core values of what we want a student with good character to display. One that would really tie into that is nobody walks by. So if you see someone struggling, you should help them. If you see something broken, you should try to help fix it or something. So there are these core values. We also, the wellness department, which would be our traditional gym or physical education department in another school, really takes the lead in planning that. Lastly, we have a special advisory period called Home Base that's worked into our weekly schedules, and the students generally see their home base teacher 2 times a week, and there are special lessons that revolve around like internet safety or bullying or various topics that would be addressed by that question. So, and sorry, there's one more that I just thought of. The last thing would be morning meeting, which at the end of the month or at the end of the week, we have a sort of middle school meeting where students get awards, are rewarded for good actions or achievements, and we're sort of trying to encourage through positive reinforcement those good character traits that all schools really need to instill in their students.
Yeah, I think just to build on that too is whenever there are project rubrics used by the teachers at the schools, there are always categories that relate to social emotional learning, so around leadership, collaboration, teamwork, and then also Shula can probably talk to one of the games that has been used in wellness to help teach character, like motion was one, or Shula, if you want to explain a little bit about a game specifically designed around character.
Yeah, so Emotion Motion was a game that was designed for the 6th grade wellness domain, and I think I actually did not work on the game, so I'm not super familiar, but I think the main learning goals were sort of helping students to begin identifying emotions both in themselves and in other people, so sort of developing a self-awareness but also an empathy for what other people might be experiencing and what signs of different emotions might look like. So as students played the game, I think they would draw a card that would have an emotion like anger, and then the game would prompt them to try to get their teammates to guess what the emotion. They could either act it out, they could draw something. I forget the other ways, but so basically it's getting students to sort of grapple with these emotions in a game-like way. And then I also wanted to talk quickly, actually, we had a boss level that was totally centered around bullying, and so a group of students who they were really aware of the bullying that many students experience these days, and they actually used sort of like some systems thinking to the issue of bullying and what causes it and why does it keep happening and perpetrators and victims and all of the different factors that play into bullying, and they tried to explore it as a system so that they could find what we call a systems thinking term leverage points for creating change in the system. So they actually began a whole initiative at the school just based on their own interests. Even after the boss level was done, they wanted to continue working on this, and it turned into an after school, and these kids were really invested in solving this issue in this way.
It's amazing. So we are actually out of time. I want to especially thank Kate and Eliza for joining us today. They're on vacation and they are taking out their time to be part of this webinar. So join us for the next episode of Playtime Online, Wednesday, August 14th, to learn about Institute of Play's newest lab, ABLE. We'll be joined by the lab's co-directors, Eliza included, as they illustrate what the lab's work looks like in action. For updates on Playtime Online, sign up for our mailing list. Just click the Join Us at the top of this page. Thanks for watching, and if you like what we're doing, please spread the word. Have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thanks.